As wedding bells echoed across the canyon, a Cherokee tycoon kicked open the chapel doors, snatching the bride before her tears could fall. What followed was a tale of justice, legacy, and the kind of redemption money can't buy. The wind swept over Red Echo Canyon like an old spirit whispering names it had no right to remember. Dust trailed behind a line of wagons crawling toward a makeshift chapel perched on the edge of that high cliff, its wooden steeple trembling against the sky. The chapel had no stained glass and no bells, but today it held something more valuable than gold. An unwilling bride in a lace gown stitched with fear. Her name was Evelyn Whitmore, and she had once been the brightest fire in the frontier town of Elkhorn Ridge. Folks used to say she rode faster than thunder and danced like the flames she was named after. But that fire had dimmed the day her father, a broken rancher drowning in debts, promised her hand to a man 3 times her age, Bartholomew Crane, the town's richest banker and its cruelest creditor. No one knew what terrified her more, the vows or the hands that would come after them. The canyon yawned wide below, as if ready to swallow her whole, but it was the silence in the pews that haunted her most. No friends, no kin, just the hollow eyes of those bought by wealth or paralyzed by fear. The preacher didn't dare look her in the eye. He had seen enough forced unions to know what it looked like when a bride was marching to her own funeral in silk, and then the silence cracked. A lone horse's hooves thundered across the brittle soil. The doors of the chapel flung open like judgment had arrived, and in stepped a man wrapped in leather and dust, with braids that spoke of heritage, and boots that left no doubt he'd seen war. He moved like time was on his side, shoulders squared, eyes locked on Evelyn. It was Elias Stormhorse, the reclusive Cherokee tycoon who hadn't been seen in these parts for nearly 6 years. Some said he had left to build railroads in the east. Others whispered he'd gone to war against business barons who thought his skin made him soft. But now he stood in the chapel's doorway like a myth made flesh, calm, deadly, and without explanation. Crane's face twisted. His pride puffed, but Elias didn't glance his way. His eyes were only for Evelyn, and before a single protest could find a mouth, Elias walked down the aisle, lifted the trembling bride into his arms, and turned back toward the canyon with a calm that shamed every man in that room. No one moved. Not the preacher, not Crane, not the sheriff. Because they all remembered what happened last time someone stood between Elias Stormhorse and a woman in danger. By the time they reached the canyon ridge, dust rose behind him like smoke from judgment's fire. Evelyn clung to his chest, breath shallow but eyes wide, not in fear but in the shock of freedom. Somewhere deep inside her, a memory stirred, a memory of a summer day long ago, when a boy with braids swore he'd come back for her. And now, as the canyon echoed with the hooves of redemption, that promise was kept. Elias Stormhorse didn't speak as he rode through the brittle scrubland, holding Evelyn close while the wind tangled in her veil like it, too, wanted to flee the chapel. The horse beneath the man obsidian-colored Mustang named Waya moved with the fury of a memory returning home. Every hoof strike was a reminder that Elias had once left this land not to forget her, but to become a man who could protect her. Behind them, chaos had bloomed. Bartholomew Crane barked orders like a wounded wolf, summoning lawmen who had long sold their spines for shares in his iron trains and dead-end mines. But even they hesitated. Elias wasn't just a tycoon, he was a man who had walked with governors and traded with warlords. His wealth was thunder, and his hands had once bled beside theirs in battle. No badge dared chase him, not yet. They reached the rim of Winding Bluff just as the sun began to collapse behind the buttes. Evelyn's breath came in shallow bursts. Her cheeks were pale, but her eyes flickered with a new kind of light shock, disbelief, and something buried deeper, gratitude. It had been so long since someone chose her before choosing power. And Elias, he had chosen her in front of an entire town. He laid her down beside the remains of an old fire pit where, years ago, 2 children had cooked beans over stolen matches and made promises with broken sticks. She didn't remember everything time. And pain had dimmed her youth, but she remembered a boy with sharp eyes and gentle hands, a boy who once whispered, "I'll come back rich enough to buy the sky." And you won't ever have to marry a man like Crane, now that boy was here. Only he wasn't a boy anymore. Elias knelt and handed her a canteen from his saddlebag. The water tasted of pinewood and rain. She took a long sip, watching him with the same caution she once had for coyotes near the chicken coops. Her hands trembled as she touched the dirt around the fire pit. It was real. All of it was real. Down in Elkhorn Ridge, the story was spreading like wildfire across saloons and sewing circles. Some said Elias was a ghost. Others claimed he had come to steal Crane's fortune, not his bride. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Elias had heard the rumors, had read the silent panic in the letters never sent, had seen the bruises behind her forced smiles when the railroad papers showed her photo at Crane's side. Evelyn had been dying behind silk curtains, and Elias had come to cut through them, but not everything was behind them. Bartholomew Crane wasn't a man to be embarrassed without revenge. That night, he hired a scout to track Elias through the desert. The man Tom Bexley was once a bounty hunter, now a ghost who sold his services to the highest bidder. And Crane offered more than gold. He offered land, legacy. Tom didn't ask questions. He just nodded and followed the wind back on the ridge. Evelyn fell asleep near the old fire pit while Elias sat beneath the moon with a rifle across his lap. His eyes scanned the dark. He knew Crane wouldn't sit still. The wedding was only a symbol. What Crane wanted was control. What Elias had taken was something money couldn't replace. By morning, the first buzzard circled high above watchers in the sky, waiting to see what story would unfold next. And beneath them, Elias' Stormhorse etched a mark into the earth with the tip of his knife. It was a half circle, the same mark they'd carved as kids, a symbol that said, "We return to the place where we began, and from here we build again." But not all stories begin again in peace. Some begin again with blood. Tom Bexley rode like a shadow stretched across the land, silent, determined, and barely seen. His horse was lean, its ribs like ridges carved by wind, but it ran with the endurance of a beast that had tasted blood. Bexley didn't ride for justice. He rode for the thrill of cracking men open like nuts and watching the truth spill out. That's what Crane loved about him. He didn't care about reasons, only results. He tracked Elias by the faintest clues, a broken stem here, a half-smoked cigar stub there, hoofprints only visible beneath the morning frost. It wasn't long before he reached the place on the bluff where ashes still whispered old memories, and the ground bore the mark of two half circles, symbols even Tom knew better than to underestimate. But while Tom closed in, Elias and Evelyn made their way toward the old Stormhorse lands, acres of untouched canyon where the Cherokee had once hunted and traded long before borders carved the land. There, Elias had built something away from the greed of the town, a sanctuary of wood and stone, guarded not by walls, but by reputation. The cabin waited beneath a mesa shaped like a warrior's jaw. The sky turned blood orange as the sun dipped low. Evelyn, though exhausted, moved differently now, less like a possession and more like someone remembering how to stand in her own skin. She had washed the weight of Crane's world from her face, and in the lines of her expression, traces of the wild frontier girl flickered to life again. Elias didn't speak much. He let the silence explain what words couldn't. This wasn't a rescue. It was a return, and every log of that cabin, every trail carved through the brush, every tool still hanging on the walls, had been made for the moment she might one day walk through its door again. But redemption has a price. That night, as Evelyn fell into a deep sleep beneath a woven wool blanket, Elias stood outside, staring into the horizon with the weight of war pressing on his shoulders. The coyotes howled, the stars blinked, and somewhere beyond the canyon's mouth, a glint of steel reflected the moonlight. Tom Bexley had arrived. He didn't charge in. He waited. At dawn, Elias stepped out, rifle in hand, boots soft on the earth. He knew someone was watching. The air was too still, the birds too quiet. And in that hush, memories came flooding back of battles in Mexico, of nights hunted by railroad tycoons who wanted his land turned into smoke and profit. of losing friends to men who spoke with money and killed with silence, he walked past the edge of the cabin and stood tall on the cliff, inviting the shot. But Tom didn't shoot. He stepped out instead, calm, confident, with his gun still holstered and his words buried in a smirk. Two men stared across the space between them, one who had built everything and one who burned things to earn his keep. Bexley tossed a coin into the air and caught it without looking. Crane says, "Bring her back." His eyes seemed to say, "I say, let's see who really owns this redemption." And just like that, the wind turned cold. Evelyn watched from the cabin, heart thudding. She didn't know the man, but she knew the silence of killers. And in that silence, the battle had already begun. The sun split the sky like a blade, casting sharp golden light across the canyon floor. Elias and Tom stood still, two men bound by different creeds, one carved from legacy, the other from lawlessness. And though neither spoke, the land between them remembered the weight of blood. This wasn't the first time honor and violence had shared breath on Stormhorse soil. Tom Bexley didn't draw first. That wasn't his way. He liked to give men hope, then take it from them like a coin snatched from a child's hand. He stepped forward, hand resting near his holster, boots pressing dust into ancient ground. Crane said, "Bring her back." His eyes seemed to say again, but he didn't say alive or whole. Elias didn't flinch. He knew men like Tom didn't deal in justice, they dealt in erasure. And yet, something about Elias unnerved the bounty rider. Maybe it was how calm he stood with death nearby. Maybe it was that Stormhorse's rifle never lifted, not even once. Behind them, Evelyn watched through a thin crack in the cabin's window. Her hands clenched, heart pounding not just from fear, but fury. Crane's world wasn't finished with her. She had been stolen once by fate, and now fate dared to try again. But this time, she wasn't the same girl with ribbons in her hair. And Elias wasn't just a boy with promises. He was a storm that had returned to keep them. The standoff broke like thunder cracking a bone. Tom reached, but not for his gun. He pulled a long, curved knife from his belt and lunged. His kind didn't care for fair fights. They liked scars and ambushes. But Elias moved like wind through wheat. He dodged, sidestepped, and brought his boot down with a grunt that echoed off the cliffs. The knife clattered, and the two men crashed into the dirt like bulls locked in a death grip. Death swallowed them. Elias was older than Tom, but stronger in silence. His hands weren't shaped by greed, they were shaped by purpose. And as he slammed Tom into the dirt again and again, the past came roaring back. Every punch was for the children driven from Cherokee homes. Every strike was for the farmers who lost their land to men like Crane. Every breath was a reminder that Elias had returned not just for Evelyn but for justice itself. Tom reached for his pistol, but Evelyn was already outside. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She picked up Elias's rifle and, for the first time in her life, held the weight of her own fate in her hands. One step closer. Another. Tom looked up. Eyes wide. Click. Elias stood and took the rifle gently from her. Not to protect her, but to shield her from carrying that final memory. He didn't need to shoot. Tom crawled away, broken, bruised, humiliated. The message was clear. No bounty ever came back from Stormhorse land. That night, they lit a fire, not to keep warm, but to bury the last ghost of Crane's reach. Evelyn sat close to Elias. She wasn't afraid anymore. The cabin, the cliff, the earth, it all felt like home again. Like destiny had cracked open just enough to let her rewrite her name in the dirt. But in Elkhorn Ridge, Bartholomew Crane stared into a glass of whiskey and promised that the next move would not be so quiet. Because for men like Crane, nothing was more dangerous than losing control of a woman they never truly had. And redemption still had one more mile to ride. The canyon winds howled louder the next morning, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Evelyn stood on the porch of the Stormhorse cabin, her dress no longer the laced cage from the wedding but a plain wool gown cinched with leather. She looked like she belonged there not as a kept bride, but as a woman reborn. Her eyes scanned the horizon while Elias saddled Wea, both of them knowing the silence wouldn't last. Back in Elkhorn Ridge, Bartholomew Crane gathered what was left of his influence. His pride had been shattered in a chapel, his command defied by a man he'd once called savage, and now, with the whole town whispering of Elias's return and Evelyn's escape, his legacy bled like a wound he couldn't stitch shut. His name was no longer spoken with reverence but with doubt. That terrified him, so he did what desperate men always do. He tried to buy what couldn't be earned. He offered bounties that could choke a cattle train. He bribed the sheriffs, deputies with deeds and silver, and then he did the unthinkable. He rode out himself. Crane was not a man of the wild. His boots weren't made for dust. His hands had never gripped a rifle in defense of anything. But vengeance is its own fever, and he burned hotter than any sun that day. He reached Stormhorse Land near dusk. Alone. And still blind with entitlement, Elias saw him first, not through binoculars, but through instinct. He knew Crane wouldn't send someone else this time. The man's ego needed to see her, to speak to her, to remind her that in his mind, she still belonged to him, but Evelyn didn't. Wait to be spoken to. She walked down the slope barefoot, dust rising in soft clouds behind her. Crane dismounted, startled by her presence, by her transformation. Gone was the trembling porcelain doll he'd bought like cattle. This woman walked like stone under moonlight, steady, unshaken, and afraid. Crane opened his mouth to speak, but Elias was already behind her. The three of them stood under the burnt orange sky, where shadows stretched like old truths, and time slowed just enough for the world to listen. Evelyn didn't shout. She didn't beg. She handed Crane a single folded letter, her mother's will. A document that proved the land Crane stole had never been his. It was hers all along. Signed, sealed, and made legal before Crane had even met her father. The lawyer who drafted it had been paid in secret by her mother and later disappeared. But Elias had tracked him down, buried in a miner's town, and brought the truth back from the grave. Crane's hands trembled as he read. He tore the paper. Elias didn't blink, because it didn't matter. The land wasn't just legally Evelyn's, it was morally untouchable now. The town had heard the story. They knew about the wedding, about the rescue, about the rifle. Crane's empire wasn't just collapsing, an ink it was being swallowed by justice itself. And when Crane reached for his pistol, perhaps thinking he could still win something back, he was met by the sound of dozens of hooves. From the hills emerged the Cherokee riders. Old friends of Elias. Veterans. Brothers. They didn't raise their guns. They didn't need to. Crane froze. He dropped the pistol. And with no more words, no more pride, and no more power, he mounted his horse and disappeared into the desert. No one saw him again, not in Elkhorn Ridge, not in the canyons, not in the tales whispered by Firelight. He became nothing more than a name people used when warning young men what happens when you chase control instead of character. As the sun dipped and stars woke one by one, Evelyn and Elias stood on that ridge not as fugitives, but as founders. Of truth, of justice, of frontier redemption. And when the wind howled through the canyon that night, it didn't echo sorrow. It echoed freedom.